Namaskar and welcome to Kolkata Centre for Creativity's first annual conference, Performing Performance 2020, on the theme of Women in Performance. My name is Titash and I'm here just to give some introduction. We, Kolkata Centre for Creativity, are a multidisciplinary interactive arts center that has been working in the areas of research and development in art language, art practice, and diverse discourses of inclusivity, capacity building, and well-being through debates and discussions, presentation, promotion, appreciation, and application of different art disciplines in cultural landscape of contemporary India since its inception in November 2018. As a culmination of its art research and developmental practices, KCC aims for effective change through application and accessibility by providing a bridge between artists, scholars, students, enthusiasts, and people from different communities with diversity of choice, opportunities, and challenges. Thus, today's conference carries special significance for us. We hope this 2 days conference at KCC will progress the discourse further in practice, policies, and social application. First, I would like to introduce the flow of the evening. After this introduction, the director of Kolkata Centre for Creativity will present her welcome note. Then we shall hear today's keynote speech. After the keynote speech, I shall introduce the moderator of today's panel, and she will introduce you with our panelists and the order of presentation. After the panelists' presentations are over, the moderator will open the floor for question and answer session. After the session is over, KCC's director will present her concluding speech, and with the mention of our outreach collaborators, today's session will come to an end. During this session, if you have any comments, please put them in the chat box. If you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer box, because otherwise it gets very messy if we need to find out the questions from the chat boxes. As we have limited time, we may not be able to address all the questions, but we'll surely get back to you with the answers later. I would take this moment to introduce to you the director of Kolkata Centre for Creativity, Ms. Trina, who is also taken up the responsibility of President of ICOM India and a board member of ICOM Intercom. She has been spearheading many projects in KCC to promote research and development in different disciplines of art that leads to a volumetric and qualitative impact not only in the art field but also in the society, with special focus to young artists and performers. Trina champions and facilitates inclusion, diversity, and gender equality in museums and art spaces. She is pioneering social changes, creating an inclusive culture in KCC that addresses different abilities, choices, gender and sexual diversity, and marginalized communities through appreciation and applications of art. She is a recipient of several prestigious fellowships. She has presented papers in museum conferences on various international platforms. I would request Ms. Diwan to please present her welcome note, opening the platform for the conference. Ma'am.
Thank you so much, Titas. On behalf of Kolkata Centre for Creativity, I am delighted to welcome our audience, our keynote speaker, Ms. Lubna Marium, our esteemed and learned panelist, Dr. Bishnupriya Dutt, Dr. Urmimala Sarkar, Dr. Trina, Nileena Banerjee, and moderator, Meghna, Bhardwaj. It is my honor to present KCC's first annual conference on performing arts, Performing Performance 2020. Theme of this year is Women in Performance. As a research and development center, KCC works on various approaches in art and cultural landscape. On one hand, we work with emerging artists for bringing experimental works, and on the other hand, we work with senior scholars and practitioners through workshops, talks, and webinars. With this interaction of theory and practice, we ensure there is a constant dialogue and knowledge sharing. We base this conference on the same principle, and therefore for us, today is a very significant day of this journey. While we planned this conference on a bigger scale in the physical space with more possibilities of exchanges and dialogues, we had to negotiate and redesign it to suit the virtual platform, as we did not want to miss the opportunity of initiating this platform for addressing critical issues in performing arts. The machinery of marginalization always finds discriminatory factors in the name of gender, race, religion, caste, and different choices that people make. But performance, in many forms, have always challenged that squeezing space with robust expressions. As a result, women in performance does not come in isolation, and we decided to start our annual conference on this theme. I want to thank all our collaborators who have been with us as our outreach partners. I would like to thank each one of you for being with us today, and I'm really looking forward to having an enriching session with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Srimati Lubna Marium as the keynote speaker of today's discussion on the theme of body performance. An eminent dancer, art director, researcher, and cultural activist, Srimati Lubna Marium is a revered figure in South Asian dance fraternity. She is the Vice President of World Dance Alliance Asia Pacific, who participates in various cultural organizations. She is praised for her contributions to promote Indian classical and indigenous dance forms among Bangladeshi dancers. Her organization, Shadhana and Kalpataru, are proceeding significant work in dance and performance in Southeast Asia. Srimati Lubna Marium today is presenting her paper, Srishti derived from Dhatu Shrij, Letting Go, Letting Loose, a Whimsy, as her keynote speech for today's discussion. Ma'am.
Thank you, Titash. Thank you, Kolkata Creativity Center. It's a pleasure to be collaborating with such a auspicious get-together. And I do hope this is the first of many more. I do believe the COVID has taught us one thing, how to be in touch using technology. That is something that I really have benefited from. So women in performance, there's so many layers to women in performance. Women performing their lives, women in the space of performance, and women in which space of performance, in the folk performance. So it's a vast topic, and I believe these 2 days, many of these topics will be covered. But today I decided to have a bit of fun. I wrote a whimsy. Whimsy is something I write when I was doing my Sanskrit studies. I came across the Jatakamala stories, and I thought, oh, good. That's a good way of, trying to understand if I have understood all these wonderful philosophies. So I sat down and wrote a whimsy and recorded it, and I hope it gets through to all of you. I hope you enjoy it.
Akashi's story was related only in whispers at Roshan Shahi's house, the quietly austere abode of the most revered religious mendicant in the country, set in the midst of a verdant forest, far, far away from almost India. The Accra was near idyllic, with the wind chiming through the nearby bamboo grove, as the minstrels sang out their devotion night and day. Devotees from far and wide also spoke ecstatically about the new Chinese companion, lovingly called Urmimala, cooked from the simple alms collected by men during Madhuri, like the bees collecting madhu or honey from here, there, and everywhere. Then, one year in the auspicious month of Shara, when the riverside was abloom with the swaying white cash blossoms, the ended couple of years, they lovingly named her Akashi. The child soon became the apple of Chinese eye. As she grew older, it was obvious that she had the keen intellect of her father and seemed to absorb his words almost in total, horses. Once in a while, a voice coming from the baby's mouth would startle the old presenter. He would shake his head and silently do, if only she could have been my son. The ladies in the household though were not so kind. Shyly they admonished, you are spoiling her. Akashi needs to learn modesty, not mantras. She has to learn to roll out bread for the household and not just play the dotara. The indulgent father rarely relented. You women wouldn't understand. Just listen to her wise, thoughtful debates. Even my friend Humayun was defeated by Akashi's rebuttal on his exposition of the ways of acquiring knowledge. Do you know that the child fearlessly accused us of teaching through mimicry and repetition? The entire Sadhu Sangha was stunned. Purima just shook her head in dismay. And then puberty happened to Akashi. Reality hit the young girl. With her loving father gradually became distance, resentment. Not Baba anymore, instead just fighting. Akashi decided to become his best disciple. This increased Shaiji's worries. Purima, cannot you focus more on Akashi's upbringing? Complained Shaiji one evening, sitting in the lamp-lit room. Why must she sing about sacred rivers rising once a month? Twilight language or not, it's obvious she's referring to a woman's monthly fluid flow. Overhearing from the adjacent room, Akashi laughed out loud. Shaiji, that's how babies are born. Grow up. Oh, and don't you dare blame Purima. You know whose lap I grew up on. Impertinence is going to bring about your end, was the stern reply. Akashi's woes increased when Rob, a young scholar, took up residence in the Agra. The hopeful twinkle in her parents' eyes hardened Akashi's defenses even more. Make that parrot my Shadhan Shongi, was her swift response when Purima tentatively brought up the topic. Firstly, Ma, I don't need a partner to realize my truth. It is within me. And even if I did, it wouldn't be someone who cannot think for himself. None of Akashi's arguments seemed of any avail. The entire Accra went into a festive mode organizing the union of the young couple. You will all regret this, muttered Akashi ominously. Shaiji walked around with a smile. It takes a twinkling only to put them in their place. Akashi waited in vain to try and reason with her aging preceptor. No avail. Then she decided to park herself at the doorstep of the Gurukul as Shaiji was engrossed in his discourse on the creation of this magnificent universe. In his deep and melodious voice he recited, Anandochalita Shakti Srijyati Atmanam Atmanam. In utter delight, Shakti lets herself go forth into manifestation. At this, Akashi couldn't contain herself anymore. She brushed past one and all and confronted the aging Shai. That is what I have been saying to you all along. Females are the only species who procreate. You are wrong, you know. I don't need a partner. The truth is contained in me. Srishti, honorable preceptor, as you taught us, is derived from the root srija, which means dead wood, pour forth, to project. Enough! Was Shaiji's first gruff admonition. Purima too rushed in, but there was no stopping Akashi. Did you not teach us that the world process lies within us all? Creativity comes from within. It is an emanation, like the world. Truth is a theophany. Your life Your teachings are wrong, Honorable Shaiji. No one can be taught the truth. We cannot be defined by others but ourselves alone. Turning his back to the distraught girl, distinctly and quietly, Fakir Shahi uttered the ominous words. Take her out. I do not want to see her again. And so you shall not, screamed Akash. The pin-drop silence which shrouded the Agra that cold wintry day never since then got any impetus to dip its way out. Nakashi? During the years, Akashi Bao's been far right. Yes, he never ever entered the Agra. But every year on the 4th of Magh, yet other wintry days, for the Sadhu Sangho to celebrate her preceptor Roshan Fakir's day of initiation. Amidst all the festivities in the Agra, the entire village awaited her presence as Akashi paid him respect, but from afar. The old shine would look out of his doorway, but would only hear her powerful voice sing her tribute. A tiny tear drop at times rolled down his cheeks as the words pierced his heart. Every time my eyes buckle my wound, how do you die?
That didn't go too well. I don't think any of you could hear it properly.
No, really could not.
Yeah, so I have requested Kolkata Creativity Center to share the text with everyone. Is that possible?
Yes.
Yes, it is possible.
I should have done that before.
Yeah, it can go wrong in many levels. This whole technological thing.
Yes, that's right.
It's good, but sometimes, yeah.
This is actually about Baul singer from Bangladesh. This is about her life, and I thought that I will try to bring out the whole concept of the body and the women in performance through her life. What should we do?
What we can do is we have everybody's email. We can email them the text if that is what you want.
Summarize the story.
Or the video link.
The video
That's
is just
terrible.
no. There's nothing in the video. It's the story. Anyway,
Yeah.
this is something which has worried me a lot recently. The way we teach, the pedagogy. I was born in a very strange time, in a strange land, where we were distanced from almost all of South Asia. I was born in a Pakistani regime, and we had absolutely no idea about what these classical forms of dances were. But we were very, very lucky to have been part of a very vibrant cultural movement. And also a lot of Uday Shankar's work and the work being done in Shanti Niketan that trickled down to us through Amartya Sen's mother, Amita Di, and Bulbul Chaudhuri. So later when I came across the classical forms, I was in awe and I wanted to learn it all. But as I grow older, I somehow feel that we were blessed that we didn't learn the classical forms because we learned how to create. It came from within us. There was this impetus to fight the ruling party, to fight oppression. I somehow feel that in our pedagogy today, which we have borrowed from the Indian classical styles, we have lost out that vibrant way of creating. And I keep on thinking, how should I bring that back? Because I do believe that creativity has to come from within. Yes, you can teach a lot of techniques, but to be able to create, it has to come from within. That's about all I was trying to say. Maybe you can all read it later and get back to me.
As I was fortunate enough to actually could hear most of it, I would not say all of it. I could get the gist, and I would say that
Could you?
yes, little bit more from my experience of being and performing rather than even right now. Yes, I think a lot of time writing
Do.
anything in space is a lot that is coming from a vocabulary, but where the vocabulary start, maybe that is the question that we are asking here. I would like you to please take a few more minutes, and if you want to say, elaborate on that.
I couldn't get what you said. Could you repeat a bit, Titash?
Yes. I'm just saying that from my being or myself being here right now, what I was understanding from what I could hear from the story and right now reading a little bit, that where it is starting is the question maybe we are asking here right now. If it is performance in a space or in a social space, is it the vocabulary or the ornamentation that is making it a performance, or is it the beginning of it where the vocabulary is not necessary and
Well,
where the vocabulary
I
is
will
coming?
share some. I will share something.
Please.
I will share something very personal. My daughter too is an artist, and we have these huge differences of opinion. She keeps on telling me that you, especially about my dance school, that you all focus too much on teaching children how to perform. You don't allow them to think about what they want to perform. You don't. It's more about the interiority of a artist. Are we doing enough to nurture that? That is something I worry about since I run one of the largest dance schools in Bangladesh. And when I compare it with my own childhood, where we did not learn any of these forms, classical forms, but we were performing every day, we were performing against oppression. We had to. It was something that we had to do. It was existential. Performance was something we had to perform. Otherwise, we would not be who we were. We would forget our identities. How did we do that? I keep on thinking, without having learned any of these classical forms. I think we searched within ourselves, and that is something, unfortunately, I too have not been able to do with my own school. And I worry about that, whether I'm being fair to the children who are coming to our schools, not allowing them to create, to be free. And because creativity, like I said, Srishti is from the Dhatu Srija. It means to manifest. It doesn't need anything from outside. It's within the aham, and then it is manifested. as it is with all of us. I don't know. Was I able to explain?
Yes, thank you. It's already a very charged up space that you proposed, Lubnadi. And there, I think Meghna will take up and she will actually diversify. I would now
And I
introduce.
also wanted to point out that women are naturally creators.
Yes, I would now like to introduce Meghna to actually build upon this charged up space that Lubnadi already has proposed. Miss Meghna Bhardwaj is a Delhi-based dancer trained in ballet, jazz, and contemporary dance techniques. She is also a dance scholar who has finished her doctorate in theater and performance studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Theater uh, and Performance Studies she has done from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Meghna is currently teaching at the Department of Arts and Performing Arts, Shiv Nadar University, Greater Noida. And Meghna is going to moderate today's panel. So I would request Meghna to please take over and introduce today's panel.
Thank you, Titas, and thank you, KCC, for inviting me to this very exciting discussion. And thanks a lot, Lubna Di, for bringing the term WIM, because I think it's one of the most beautiful words. And also, when you were talking about upbringing and when you were talking about your daughter, I was thinking, since there is a little baby in our family at the moment, I was actually thinking, how should we tell the little girls that there is a compassionate world out there where they can, they don't have to fight to live, and they can freely practice WIM and trigger the notion of, disciplined time. They can abstract time, they can do poetry, because I think that's the most powerful form of resistance one would ever know. So I was quite delighted, and thank you so much, even though I did not hear properly, but the sound was quite beautiful. So I just enjoyed the sound effect of it. So thank you anyway. I will now introduce the three panelists for the evening. Dr. Urmimala Sarkar Munshi, Dr. Bishnupriya Dutt, and Dr. Trina Nileena Banerjee. Dr. Munshi is an Associate Professor of Theatre and Performance Studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. Her specialization is in dance studies, visual anthropology, and ethnographic research. Her current work is on changing landscapes of dance in India, trafficking, violence against women, and designing of survival processes for survivors, politics of performance, gender, labor, identities, and hierarchies. Urmimala is currently the president of World Dance Alliance Asia Pacific. She's the co-editor of the peer-reviewed open access online journal of emerging dance scholarship. Urmimala was a co-investigator for the recently concluded project Crisis of Democracy and Cultural Trauma, funded by Consortium of Humanities Center and Institute and Consortium of Humanities Center and Institute and Mellon Foundation. Her recent most book is The Moving Space, Women in Dance. Her autoethnographical essay, Revisiting Being Rama, Playing the God in Changing Times, co-edited by Paula Richman and Rustam Barucha, is being published by the Oxford University Press, New York. Dr. Bishnupriya Dutt is Professor of Theatre and Performance Studies in the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. Her area of research includes colonial and post-colonial histories of theatre, feminist readings of Indian theatre and contemporary performance practices, and popular culture. Her recent publications include Gendered Citizenship, Performance and Manifestation, October Revolution, Echoes of the Past, Lenin in Popular Sites in Theatre, Protesting Violence, Feminist Performance Activism in Contemporary India. She has also led a number of international project collaborations with University of Warwick, Freie University, Berlin, and University of Cologne. She's currently the Vice President of the International Federation for Theatre Research. Bishnupriya has been involved in active theatre in Calcutta since 1960s with the Little Theatre Group and later People's Little Theatre, where she performs and directs. Dr. Trina Banerjee, after completing her MA in English Literature from Jadavpur University, Dr. Banerjee proceeded to complete a Master's of Studies in English at the University of Oxford. For her PhD, she worked on a history of women in the group theatre movement in Bengal between 1950 and 1980. She has also been researching the interfaces between women's movements in political theatre in contemporary Manipur for several years now. Her essays and reviews in these and other subjects have appeared in national and international journals, as well as in several edited volumes. She writes both in English and in Bengali. Between 2011 and 13, she taught at the Theatre and Performance Studies Department at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. She's currently Assistant Professor in Cultural Studies at the Centre for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. Her research interests include gender, performance, political theatre, theories of the body, post-colonial theatre, and South Asian history. She's also been a theatre and film actress, as well as a journalist and a fiction writer. Her book, Performing Silence, Women in the Group Theatre Movement in Bengal, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, India, in 2019 until 20. I would now like to invite Dr. Sarkar to begin the discussion with her paper. Dr. Sarkar.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank KCC for organizing this event. I explore today's theme through my paper, Becoming the Body. And I come in through, and I look at the whole theme through my experience as a dancer. I've been a dancer all my life, and also a scholar who has tried to look at dancing body specifically. All dancing bodies are created and crafted. They are bodies that speak and bodies that prepare to occupy public realms. There could be a differentiation of dancers on the basis of whether he or she is a dancer by choice or by necessity or by imposition. By whatever is the path for anyone to have become a dancer, I propose in my paper that he or she first becomes a body during the time of the initiation process and then a dancer. At this point, I would like to actually thank Lubna for her story. I could hear quite clearly. And I actually wanted to say that, with her small explanation later, she actually kind of created an introduction to my paper. So this paper contextualizes these basic facts within a few specific empirical examples. As one of the methodological principles, this research keeps the idea of a relationship between the dance, the dancer, and the dancing body at the very center of the argument. It therefore investigates at one level the choice or lack thereof to having a certain form of engagement with the body through the act of becoming, one, dancers trained in a specific Indian dance form, largely considered a hobby or a leisure activity, or two, professional dancers who have chosen or been forced to dance in order to earn a living. While dancers of all genders have their own negotiations with the differential reception, whereby some dancing bodies are lauded and appreciated and even rewarded for the practice and dedication, while others are marginalized for using their skill and training in dance as that helps them earn a living. For example, in classical dances, may I have the first slide? Thank you. For example, in classical dances, in spite of using dance skills to earn a living, the bodies are respected as dedicated tools. While for marginal dance forms such as Lavani or Nachni, the bodies used in dance are considered dangerous, deviant, and available for sexual exploitation. The different formulations of reception are based on the way the dancing bodies devise their own negotiations with riding the gaze, submitting to the gaze, inviting the gaze, and controlling the gaze. Though I would have loved to talk about the role of the nation state in shaping reception to bodies of different genders, castes, and classes, for today's talk, I keep my focus on some bodies that are glorified as representation of history and culture, while others are publicly shunned as seeking or providing pleasure or money or both, for money or both. Can we go to the slide 2, please? Slide 3? Yes, please. Thank you. In the world of classical dances, the words used to create a perfectly docile mind and an equally or more disciplined dancing body are dedication to and acceptance of the Guru Shishya Parampara, and of the responsibility to become the vessel for carrying the regional and national culture. All this is accompanied by the yet another problematic imposition of becoming the guard against any misuse of cultural history. The dancer bows down under the pressure of carrying all this information in the body. The body is constantly on guard against itself, against any unauthorized siphoning of the dance history that it carries. This is the case for many classical dancers. Their bodies are trained without them knowing the history of the dance. A string of mytho-history perpetuates in absence of any update from recent scholarship or the forms. The ingredients to prepare in preparation of such a body in dance, thus, docility, acceptance, dedication, and ambition, only as much as prescribed as healthy by the Guru. And of course, innumerable references to Natya Shastra. Thus, the training in technique comes with being molded as an ideal modern representative of the national culture at once existing in 2 time zones. Apart from being a modern woman, the dancer then also has to be trained in a way so that she keeps the history of the nation alive in her body. For many young learners, this is beyond comprehension, but they start feeling fascinated by the fantastic history of India, are happy finding space for themselves in it. The deep impact on the body of such socio-culturally manipulative disciplines, coupled with the inherent competitive, ambitious approach, is life-defining for most dancers. The bodies of these citizen subjects are disciplined, but don't know why. They are docile, but just justify that acquired characteristic as socialization as well as enculturation. They learn techniques without knowing where and how these formulae of moving came from, why they are important. The bodies thus also are traumatized ones. They never learn to question. They never learn to acknowledge pleasure. Dance is always hard work and almost never to be taken as a frivolous leisure activity. For as long as possible, the leash of docility is held tightly by the society. These trained dancing bodies become representatives of national culture, allowed to become not only the image of an ideal aesthetic representation of citizenry, an ideal example of disciplined subjugation to rules, knowledge transfers, and finally, social control. The dancing body that earns a living, therefore, is never able to escape this vulnerable space where the labor of the dancing body is not sanctioned as one that is embodying high art can without the slightest provocation, be interpreted as a sexually implicated one, where dance and sexual favors are coupled together as work. In the next section, I talk about otherwise untrained bodies that assume certain disciplined ensemble presence and power acquired by these bodies during the protests. And I use the recent protests and of Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, and National Register for Citizens, NRC, and also National Population Register, NPR, introduced by the Government of India. I have already introduced the one of the slides, one of the representations of these protests, and one of the representations, one example from the huge amount of art produced in public spaces. I use this example to set off an entirely different phenomenon, not known the world, now known the world over as Shaheen Bagh protest in Delhi very recently. In doing so, I do not want to trivialize the deep political and survival related struggle of the women of Shaheen Bagh, but would like to register the power of the ensemble act of resistive bodies in the body discourse, alongside the bodies strictly within the dance community. May we have the next slide, please? The recent protests in Delhi and in many other cities that started on 15th of December 2019 and lasted for 401 days and altered the perception about women's bodies inhabiting public spaces, got my attention. And as I looked at all these huge amount of dance readings that are available all around, it drew a large number of Muslim women, many of them in parda, out in the streets to protest against the law that was threatening to challenge their status as citizens. Many of them were housewives from lower and lower middle class homes, young professionals, students, elderly grandmothers, and many more. This was no performance per se, but the overall presence it created was a choreography of an unprecedented protest of determination and peaceful intent to be together against a sense of impending fear of a fate that would render a whole lot of people homeless, stateless, and countryless. The site itself encouraged many others to appear in different parts of Delhi and also all over India in protest together. The character of the protest was innovative, with artwork, posters, performances being organized, not by the participants only, but also people who wanted to publicly support the protesters. Thus, the site became rhizomic in its choreographic imagination. It was a space for assertion of rights, political discourse, impulsive and strategic imagination performances. It had a constantly shifting choreography that generated audience participation and an ongoing and evolving flash mob-like character that evolved with every embodied intervention. Susan Foster suggested in her essay, Choreographies of Protest, I do not intend to read these events as dances, for that would radically decontextualize their motivation and intent. Nor do I intend to demonstrate the close ties between artists and activists that may influence a given choice of action. I would like to continue with Susan Foster's idea while I ask, what are these bodies doing? What and how do their motions signify? What choreography, whether spontaneous or predetermined, do they enact? What kind of significance and impact does the collection of bodies make in the midst of its social surround? How does the choreography theorize corporeal, individual, and social identity? How does it construct ethnicity, gender, class, and sexuality? How have these bodies been trained? And how has the training mastered, cultivated, or facilitated their impulses? What do they share that allows them to move with one another? What kind of relationship do they establish with those who are watching their actions? What kinds of connections can be traced between their daily routines and the special moments of their protests? Can I have the slide 5, please? No. Yeah, thanks. A protest that started with a sit-in that grew more and more elaborate over the period, that saw a variety of individuals congregate in solidarity. Shaheen Bagh was constantly coping with a threat from the state apparatus as well as the ruling party's violent opposition to what was happening in the protest site. Usually, the visibility of such actions is as important as the solidarity for the protest to signify as a message. In this respect, it is like a choreography with an ensemble. Sitting in, standing, walking, sloganeering together matters. Making and having food together as a community matters too. Performing or witnessing together is another strategy commonly seen as a part of resistive strategies. The community increased its resilience through the endless hours of rehearsals it got in the process. All in all, the strategies created a corporeal coming together to think and be innovative to keep alive the resistant stance of the protesting bodies, drawing strength from each other and at the same time refusing to give space to negativity by moving together through life, day and night. These women actually created a larger than life choreographed presence through their collective body. Choreographies of protest, to borrow Foster's title from her paper mentioned above, are collective choreographed actions through which communities find ways of expressing their dissent in a creative and non-violent manner. It is done through symbolic ideas to resist oppressive situations. The bodies in such spaces have not been trained to move together, but they do. Because they draw strength and kinesthetic impulse from each other, they form a presence by giving up individuality for a larger fight for dignity and justice. In that space, tension created through the presence of all the bodies mobilizes mutual support. The space itself trains the bodies to develop a readiness to respond and accommodate violent eventualities. To conclude, I leave you with the following thoughts. Both these kinds of bodies mentioned in this presentation strangely have one thing in common. Bodies in public spaces are under scrutiny, and none of my above categories escape that surveillance. The bodies of the classical dancers are under cultural monitoring for the responsibility they are always supposed to be carrying out of aesthetic, cultural, and historical representation of the core timeless idea of the Indian culture. The political bodies, as we know, are scrutinized severely, differently by surveillance cameras, police picket, media, to be crushed under repressive state machinery, as we all have been a witness to recently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Urmidi, for such a thought-provoking presentation. When you were talking about these gestures, the embodied gestures, sitting, eating food together, standing, and so on, I was actually thinking, this is precisely the intervention of dance studies into the vocabulary of, let's say, legal systems and governance systems and, mainstream media narratives and so on. Because standing in a protest and then standing in a queue for during demonetization and then standing in national anthem and then standing in front at Tiananmen Square in front of a tank, they're all different kinds of standing with varied political weight. So thank you so much. I now invite Dr. Dutt to with her presentation, which is titled Agitating Women, Performance Activism, Multiple Protesting Sites and Dialogue. Dr. Dutt.
Thank you, Meghna. And I would like to thank Kolkata Centre for Creativity, Trina, Tita, Shravasti for having me here. And to all the listeners, my co-panelists, my students who are here, and everyone who are participating, because it's very rare that, we get to talk on, dance and theater performance and dance performance and theater on the same platform. So I'm also, sort of in the same sort of area as Urmimala, but I think it's more supplemental, and we can see how, the theater and dance are sort of supplementing and dialoguing with each other. The pandemic crisis, which we are all facing, is creating havoc on the arts, particularly the performing arts scenes, including theater, dance, music, and all forms of performing arts. Though the crisis tends to marginalize arts, bringing it to almost a point of crisis, we continue to perceive it as a metaphor, an abstraction, diverting attention from the actual effect on the material conditions, of which the body is a very key aspect. This then dominates the cultural manifestation and even the discourse, drawing attention away from responses of mourning, resilience, and resistance, which resonates with practice and scholarship, which most of us are invested in one form or the other. One such area of direct impact of the pandemic has been the interruption of the civil society movements. As Urmimala was talking about it, it has been cleansed systematically of the material remains of the protest, leading to wide-scale arrests to silence all dissidents. For many of us, and which I think Dr. Sarkar was also focusing, the erasers of the residues of the protests in Shaheen Bagh and other such sites are seen as a loss to be mourned and resistance to be built up from. The women-led civil disobedience at Shaheen Bagh and all over India, where the protesters sat in the street in durational protest for 4 months against the New Citizenship Act, was where performance activism contributed significantly. The contribution is what I would like to argue is a shifting perception of the anti-CAA protest from being defined in terms of one minority community to what many saw as the emergence of a political community. However, instead of making a claim, I would like to lay it as a proposition. Can performance activism be seen to facilitate this shifting perception of a fight for humanistic legacy, which encompasses such ideas as liberalism and, in this context, secularism? And you see from where I'm sort of, making the proposition. It's Ananya Chaudhuri's article in Indian Express. To come to the larger theme of the seminar today, bodies and performance, I would like to read these modes of performance activism through the notion of the gesture of dissent, and try to understand practice and scholarship from recent times to see how these gestures of dissent and scholarship could contribute both as a catalyst and symptomatic. Gestures of dissent in recent times are being seen as critical bodily idioms, which have connected protest sites all over the world and influenced scholarship. Laura Shalson in Theatre and Protest in context of the protest movements all over the world since 2011, flags the conspicuous use and reuse of the theatrical gestures, both to convey protest messages and to spread those messages across bodies. The performance of protest then can be seen to embody new sources of radicalism in the changing cultures of civil society. The mnemonics of protest are often expressed in bodily gestures, which offer a means to read them as performative, embodied bodily expressions in a changing political landscape of theatrical forms. According to Bas Kershaw, reading them merely as disruptive event, posited as an occasional, irrepressible blow out of a vast and usually invisible mass of turbulent socio-political material, is undermining the role performed by citizens engaged in protest with various gestural vocabulary in civil society as an integral aspect of democratic practice. The focus on gestures and hence bodies at protest sites has prompted many scholars to take into consideration theoretical references to embodied performances and bodily transgressions, and agency involved in creating gestures at sites of protest. Carrie Noland explains that gestures are segments sliced from a kinetic continuum which can be identified as significant units inscribed with cultural meanings, but also by gesturing this inscribed meaning achieve embodiment and inflection. Nolan's emphasis on agency is what is critical in this context, which is a transgression of the socially conditioned bodily practices to disturb the habitus, to surpass its communicative or instrumental purpose, and therefore afford the opportunity for interoceptive kinesthetic awareness, the intensity of which may cause subjects to alter the ways they move. Political gestures are performed directly at the sites of protest and adopts remarkable postures and use of legs or arms in ways that break traditional meanings, respond to the sites of protest and power, and can inspire a collective response. In recent times, in the Indian context, we have perceived such radical gestures, like Maya Rao's now well-known walk, originating in the aftermath of the Nirbhaya incident, and acknowledged as a powerful gesture which turned around conventional representation of victims of sexual violence into one of empowerment and mobility. And our very own gestures of Azadi from JNU, signifying freedom. I refer to two more such creative and innovative gestures which originated since 2019 in protest sites. Maya Rao has reverted back to using a number of her characteristic codified idioms from her Kathakali repertoire to create other such critical gestures. In a performance at the Artists United Against Hate on the eve of 2019 elections at Redford, from a typical Kathakali posture of lowering down on the floor, she suddenly let herself drop to the floor in a squat, the gesture of the working classes to ask with a childlike innocence, "I want food in my mouth," and made a very poignant appeal, "No more, not one more 5 years." Playing on displayed syntactical signs of the classical form, using and departing from the codes of the classical body constantly, the squat is a conspicuous postural gestural disturbance and highlights the economic hardship large numbers of the population are facing and the mundane violence and suffering of everyday life. In context of Shaheen Bagh, I can think of also the touching bodies of Zanana Ka Zamana actors and activists who come together to exhibit dissent and rebelliousness. A clump of awkward bodies press ganged into an existing set of social and performative conventions. While we rejoice at the creativity of the artists, we also need to understand that gestures may also be reduced to a formalistic category. And particularly to attribute the critical vocabulary to single authorship is problematic. And I think that's what Dr. Sarkar was trying to emphasize. But we tend to write histories on performance around individuals, mostly as hagiographies and as makers of Indian theatre. And these methods certainly do not work in these sites or in engaging with bodies and gestures in terms of performance activism. We therefore need to explore different methodological approaches, such as citizenship, questions of civil society, and notions of inclusion and exclusions. And two aspects of tools of analysis which we have almost forgotten: efficacy and transformation. It is important in this context to understand the dialectical relationship which therefore exists between the bodies at the center, who may create or perform the gesture, and the site and its people, who are not merely passive audiences of a performance. Shannon Jackson argues that the bodies, read gestures, which have managed to hold attention were often those of performers, artists, and even athletes whose bodies are conditioned and trained for going beyond the accepted norms of social conditions to perform the gestures which draws attention to sensory excesses and what Noland had told us, bodily transgressions. But as Bertolt Brecht tells us, it is very important for the gesture to be interrupted with a self-criticality and cross over from self-representation to a presence and connect the gesturing bodies to resistance. These gestures, then, according to Jenny Hughes and Simon Parry, are the ones who can reverse consensus of a mass gathering and congregation to produce dissonances and dehiscences. According to them, then, quoting Josette Ferral, they argue that since the gestures cannot pass unnoticed and is actually determined in seizing control of the quotidian, a cleft in the quotidian becomes the space of the other, the space in which the other has a place. It is imperative then to locate the gesture in the site where the other is included in active collaborative dialogue. These are in contrast to the hegemonic sites of mass congregations where consensus around majoritarian will is coerced and gestures of consent are exhibited. The protest sites and the gestures of dissent split open the agonism which exists in all social and economic structural divides and become the sites of democratic articulation and the power to exhibit dissent. Anupama Roy reads these gestures as collectively resonating in public domain, not as a marginal idiom, but which symbolize plurality and polyrhythmous variations that involve process of inversion when the familiar assumes a different meaning. The authorship of the individual making the gesture is thus challenged with an important question of theater. Who can stand in for whom? And how do different bodies signify differently? It is the dramaturgical and durational space of the protest sites which creates this displacement between the symbolic and the real, where the participation dissolves into a dialectic, collaborative mode of participation. I end with a key gesture devised by Maya Rao at Shaheen Bagh, which illustrates this sort of dialectical, collaborative imagination. To go back to what I started with, and that's the crises because of the pandemic, I would like to end with a final question. How do we rethink these radical practices, feminist or political, scholarship and solidarities amidst the systematic and structural exclusion that underpins the different impact of the pandemic, the more mundane everyday exclusion, the repressive regime, vis-a-vis the spectatorial events and gestures which we have left behind for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das. I was very excited by these two questions or arguments that you highlighted. One was when you troubled the idea of the disruptiveness of the disruptive itself, and by referring to Bas Kershaw, and you said that the disruptive instead of that has to be thought of as something inherent, continuous matter of democratic living, and something that you said about the epicentering and heroism in the protest sites, and how these issues also have to be confronted. And towards the end, I was reminded of while you were talking about raising of the fist in the JNU protest, I was thinking, yes, these gestures, they require certain kind of rush in the body, for one to raise a fist in the protest. And then there are these everyday, gestures of protest, passive resistance. For example, the women, squatting in the metro, for example, and the turning the announcements of don't squat in a metro completely farcical. I mean, we're living in an overpopulated country after all. So I'm quite excited by the talks on these gestures, and I now invite Dr. Trina with her presentation.
I'd like to thank KCC for inviting me to be part of this event. And it's actually wonderful to see even virtually some of my, seniors and colleagues and people who I really admire, whose work I've really admired in the field of performance studies here. I wanted, and it's interesting that, all three of us in this session have chosen to speak about the body in performance in relation to women, sort of trying to contextualize protests and the modes of embodiment that protests actually employ, the kind of interfaces that in fact might exist between performance and political protest in women's congregations across the subcontinent. So without further ado, my paper is called Performance as Embodied Memory, the Political Implications for Women's Protest. This talk will explore how women's protest movements have historically turned women's bodies into sites for witnessing and recording that which has been disallowed from the normative visual, political, and performative field. Sites of governmental erasure have been, thereafter, turned into eruptive vortices of embodied memory. They have performed publicly a history that dare not speak its name. With surprising frequency internationally, it has been women who have led these interventions. They have repeated and revisited traumatic memory through performance for the sake of a coming, imagined collective. The work of Diana Taylor on the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina marks perhaps the most fundamental intervention in the field of performance studies in this regard. However, like a meme that catches on, to put it in Taylor's terms, we have found echoes and resonances of such performances of trauma by women across the globe. In the Indian subcontinent, it has been the Meira Paibis or the Imas of Manipur and the mothers of the APDP in Kashmir who have held up their bodies as proof against historical erasure. Most recently, the overwhelming public assembly led by women in Shaheen Bagh, as well as other sites across the country in protest against the new discriminatory citizenship laws, has ruptured established norms of the partition of the sensible. These protests have brought into public view not just otherwise gendered modes of citizenship, but a whole world of care work and social reproduction that had hitherto been hidden from public view, let alone recognized as political. This paper will touch upon such and other ideas on women's protest, history, and public witnessing. So it has actually, the paper is in fact a series of thoughts which are not quite sort of well strung together yet. I would like to sort of start the paper with a little sort of discussion of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's essay, Enactments of Power, The Politics of Performance Space. In this essay, Ngugi writes, the struggle between the arts and the state can be best seen in performance in general and in the battle over performance space in particular. The war between art and the state is really a struggle between the power of performance in the arts and the power of the performance of power by the state. In short, enactments of power, in enactments of power, the main area of struggle is the performance space, its definition, delimitation, and regulation. He goes on to argue against Peter Brook that the performance space is never empty. It may be bare and open, yes, but it is never empty of vortices of power, nor is it an insulated field of internal relations between various elements of performance. Performance's real power, Ngugi argues, comes from its relationship to the audience. Performance transforms an apparently empty space into, I quote, a magnetic field of tensions and conflicts within which performance itself becomes a potentially explosive, I quote, sphere of power revolving around its own axis. According to Ngugi, performance is always poised to explode. The state fears it precisely because it is not isolated from other fields, even if it is apparently separated from them by material walls and architectural design. This political explosiveness is often less about the content of what is performed on stage or in the performance space, and much more about who has access to the performance space and on what terms. Who holds the power to regulate it, shrink it, expand it, and make it disappear. I quote again, Ngugi writes tellingly, it matters, in other words, whether, say, the artist's space is located in a working class district, in a bourgeois residential neighborhood, in the ghettos, or in the glossy sections of our cities. The real politics of performance space may well lie in the field of its external relations, in its actual or potential conflictual engagement with all the other shrines of power, and in particular with the forces that hold the keys to those shrines. Moreover, Ngugi argues, performance must be seen in relation to time, that is, in the context of what has gone before, history, and what might come in the future. What memories does the space carry, and what longings might it generate? So, keeping this in mind, if you actually talk about women's protests in particular, I would want to go back to a particular question that I have raised in my book, which is forthcoming this year, where I actually look at one of the figures that has stood for sort of in theatre history for a protesting woman. And the play that has been performed again and again in various kinds of adaptations is Antigone. And Antigone, of course, has very many versions. There is, of course, the Sophocles version, but there is also another very, very interesting version and sort of politically very significant version that was written by Jean Anouilh during the German occupation of France during the Second World War. So the play was written in 1943. This version of Antigone. And I won't go into details of the analysis that makes me allows me to establish this point, but let me sort of place before you a very sort of crucial question about what Antigone's transgression really is. Without summarizing the whole plot of the play, which may be familiar to a lot of you, we know that Antigone is sort of condemned to death by Creon for insisting on violating his orders by burying her brother Polynices, who has been declared a rebel and in the terms of those days an anti-national, who in fact cannot be given even the dignity of a proper burial. So he's left outside the walls of the city to be sort of for his corpse to be feasted on by vultures. And Antigone decides to bury him. She insists on burying him. So there is, of course, at the first level, the transgression that she sort of commits by deciding to disobey Creon's orders. Creon is king. But other than that, One of the things that is highlighted again and again, both in the Sophocles text as well as the Unveiled text, is the fact that Antigone transgresses merely by acting politically. So the notion is that because Antigone, and this Creon reminds Antigone again and again in the Unveiled version of the text, Antigone belongs in the homestead. She belongs in the world of, of familial congregation, of conjugal happiness, of reproduction, and not in the world of political action, which belongs to the public space of the city. So, and this actually can be quite easily located in some of Greek political thought. For example, if you actually go back to Aristotle, he describes women as not quite political beings. So women are, in fact, in some senses for Aristotle, as social beings, but not fully political beings. They're capable of congregating socially, but not really thinking and acting politically, which demands a certain measure of rationality. So women, along with slaves, belong in the sphere of the domestic space. They do not belong in the public sphere of the police, by virtue of the fact that they're fundamentally incapable of rational political thought, rational political speech, and action. So interestingly, in the Unveiled text, we continue to see that again and again, Antigone is compared not just to a mad woman, to a prostitute, but also to animals. So when the sentries of Creon first see Antigone in the act of burial, they say that at first we thought that it was a beast on all fours, digging the ground madly, trying to unearth something from it. It did not look like a human being to me. In a strange way, it is not simply the fact that Antigone disobeys Creon's orders. If a man had disobeyed those orders, he would also have been guilty. But her guilt is magnified by the fact that whether or not there is a transgression by the disobeying of orders, she has transgressed her position in this hierarchy of society by simply choosing to act politically, which is not her place. So in a sense, having chosen to leave her place in this sort of organization of, the political world and the domestic world, she has lost her place as human. So she has become something in trying to exceed her position as a woman in the city, not a full citizen. She has actually lost her place as a human being and is constantly sliding into the space of the animal. And this is very, very interesting. So the transgression, Antigone's transgression is in fact intensified, magnified, somehow made more dangerous by the fact that she chooses to act like this while being a woman. So this sort of fundamental division between the space of the political animal, capable of rational thought, of deliberation, of public discourse, and those who are relegated to a less than rational space, a space of kind of reproduction, domesticity, etc., etc. This is in fact a deeply gendered division throughout Western political thought, which gets sort of reflected in various kinds of, cultural representations of women, transgressive women especially. So much later, we have, so just keeping this in mind, keeping the notion that there is in fact this kind of really clear and sort of stark division between the political world and the world of domesticity. If we then look at some of the formulations, recent formulations that political theorists have sort of developed around recent protest movements, including the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Arab Spring, we will find that in the work of Judith Butler, she began with an essay in 2011 about that about the Arab Spring, where she was trying to sort of consider what really was going on in these sort of movements where people simply congregated in public spaces to create sort of a sit-in, or where they sort of stayed in, sort of took over public spaces in order to in order to sort of create a certain kind of intervention. So in writing about the Arab Spring, in this essay called Bodies in Alliance and the Politics of Protest, which later becomes a chapter in her book, Notes on a Performative Theory of Assembly, Butler speaks about this fundamental division between the public and the private, the corporeal and the rational. And she says that in the Occupy movements, what really changes here is that a certain kind of corporeality is brought into the public space. So people, by sitting, sleeping, living day and night in these public spaces, simply by this mode of assembly or public appearance, public embodied appearance, are creating a certain kind of sort of rupture in what is understood as political action. So they are, in fact, bringing these modes of corporeality, eating, sleeping, defecating, perhaps making love. All of these things are, in fact, brought out into the public. And this, by the very appearance of these bodies in public, a certain certain partition of the sensible is in fact broken. And this partition of the sensible has been so far a deeply gendered partition. So, this mode of occupation of public space, which has, in fact, if we look back, and this does not, in fact, start with the Arab Spring, if we look back at the work of Diana Taylor, the Latin American performance theorist, who writes sort of repeatedly about the protests that take place in Argentina during the Dirty Wars between 1978 and 1983, where thousands of young people go missing. And these disappearances are the way that the state, the military state, acts out against those it sees as dissenters. So many young people, in fact, go missing. And Taylor, in an essay about trauma and performance, writes about how, in fact, this violence of disappearance becomes so quotidian that there is a certain kind of inability to react in the general population. So there is the knowledge that these disappearances are taking place, that these families are deeply affected by these disappearances, but there is, in fact, continually the inability to react. And this Diana Taylor calls percepticide. So in the space of this kind of sort of ubiquitous percepticide, the death of perception, so to say, what becomes a sort of repetitive interruption to this status quo is the protest by the madres, that is the mothers of the disappears, who congregate in the Plaza de Mayo every week, carrying photographs of their missing children, wearing placards of the names of the disappeared and their images on their bodies, turning their bodies into sites of public witness. An interesting thing is, if you actually look at the years in which these protests take place by the madres, in the Indian subcontinent, 1980 is the year when the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is actually imposed on the state of Manipur. And what you find then is that the local groups of women in and around Imphal at that point of time, which had sort of been nascent movements against alcoholism and sort of corruption in the 70s, now come together as groups that call themselves Mera Paibis. And Mera in the Manipuri language means a torch, and the Mera Paibis are the torch bearers. So these women, after the imposition of the curfew in the evening, when the whole of the urban space has in fact been taken away from them, so that they are in effect incarcerated within their own within their own city, within their own towns, within their own villages, they leave their houses in little groups, carrying these torches, walking on these isolated streets, sometimes when the army is patrolling next to them. And there is this beautiful interview of one of these Mera Paibis where she says that the army would often stop us and ask us, Ima, where are you going? And they would say, well, we are patrolling, just like you are. So these patrols would actually then go from village to village, from town to town, to actually see if boys were being picked up randomly from their houses to be taken to the army camps and tortured. So in a way, you see another kind of occupation of public space where these women not really formulating a set of demands or sort of engaging in any kind of sort of what we understand as rational political deliberation, are merely by the physical presence of their bodies in these public spaces becoming a certain kind of witness to history. And this, interestingly, is the only way, perhaps. And so therefore the Kangla protest, which has become much talked about and much written about, which takes place in 2004, has a long history of bodies of women, mothers collectives who call themselves Imas not just of their own children, of their own, the children of their own villages, but Imas, mothers who represent perhaps the youth of Manipur, which is why a lot of the mothers in front of the Kangla fort in 2004 could call themselves Manorama's mothers. So motherhood then sort of exceeds the sphere of the domestic to become a political category. They, in fact, create the possibility in the face of absolute historical erasure, where no documents, no traces of the disappeared could any longer be found. In Argentina, there's evidence that the army went out and systematically destroyed IDs and photographs of those that had been, in fact, abducted. So this erasure from the state archive is impossible to, in fact, encounter and sort of fight in the courtroom. But the presence of these bodies in the public become, in a sense, a certain kind of witnessing of history that has been written out of the archive. And in this sense, this has everything to do with perhaps not a staged performance, but the kind of theory that perhaps Diana Taylor and Dwight Conquerwood would take us towards, the notion that the repertoire is in itself a certain kind of body of knowledge. It is also a kind of production of history, which in the absence of archival and textual document can in fact become a certain autonomous resource that allows for the possibility of political mobilization. So then to connect these ideas up is to somehow look at the theoretical interface of political studies, our understanding of what constitutes political action, and how, in fact, certain ideas and methodologies of performance studies can, in fact, allow us to rethink these notions of political action. Now, just to highlight the fact that what we commonsensically therefore understand as efficacious political action has a long and gendered history. So whether or not we are specifically speaking about women's protest, there are certain modes of protest which in themselves are actually disrupting these gender divisions between public and private. So, and it's interesting that all three of us have spoken about Shaheen Bagh, and so Shaheen Bagh was actually a sort of incredible case in point for this. There were so many articles and essays that were coming out even in the mainstream news at that point of time, which were mainstream as in, I mean, more online portals and all of that, where there were so many comments from journalists about how these women were concerned. The protesters were so concerned about whether everybody had eaten, whether tea needed to be served, whether the babies who were in the protest site were in fact taken care of. And a lot of feminists that I know saw these sort of comments as a certain kind of trivialization of the protest in a certain way, that you are actually bringing in sort of terms of domesticity and gender and sort of diluting the radical nature of the protest. But the interesting thing is that in many senses, the bringing into public of this kind of care work, along with simultaneously with the demands that were being made for recognition and for citizenship, to hold on to these rights of public representation and speech, the coming together of this was absolutely in sort of mainland India. So this, in a sense, what I was trying to say is that just like the other examples that I mentioned, Shaheen Bagh brought to the fore a certain kind of corporeality which destabilize these fundamental divisions between the public and the private, which are and have been gendered, and performance has a very, very crucial role to play in this kind of a disruption. So I'll stop here. Maybe we can address the rest of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think since we are already running out of time, I'd invite questions now. So you are requested to write your questions in the chat box, and then we can address the questions with the panelists. So Raju Rana is asking, do the women performers create multiple spaces on their own while they're instructed to perform? And the other question he's asking is, how do their bodily performances resist the hegemonic male desire for the articulation of selves?
Okay, so I am not sure whether I'm answering the questions the way they were intended to be answered, but what I feel is that women have, in Indian dance history specifically, the whole way in which women have taken over so-called the classical spaces is the way in which urban women actually stepped in as the new teachers and the new performers, and the proscenium became the women's space. So it preferred women as for the kind of general gaze, and the public, the audience became largely, though it was a mixed audience, everyone became these critical, almost having a kind of a critical gaze in terms of assessing these women performers. So this was a place that emerged with time. And of course, it was a kind of taking away of the agency from the male performers, in the sense that so the teachers in the traditional arts till date are many of them male teachers, but you don't see any of these transformations actually having any resistance, in terms of, you know, how even if you take things like many of the classical forms, the transition was done through the state machinery, and it was almost kind of wrapped in these kinds of available scholarships, available fundings for the dance, opening of institutions. So this was a kind of a space which was appearing to be a kind of a more empowering space generally for the art. But what I keep on saying is that, you know, it's a problem. The problem lies in how the state has always taken the art and not the artist. That's the problem. There is the problem. The art is something that the state wants to own. The artist is the problem. That's the undisciplined, undisciplinable body. That's the problem. So the art is owned by the state. The art is projected by the state. And then the rest of the violence happens in whichever way it needs to. I'll stop there.
I would like to say something about our folk dancers, folk performers.
Yes, Lubna.
Well, you know that 64% of our population live in the villages, while in the urban areas, performance is something you may or may not go to. For rural Bangladesh, it's a way of life. And almost every second day, there are overnight performances all over Bangladesh. And especially for the Baul singers and the women within the Baul community, it's a very, very big challenge because of also the connotations of the yogic rituals. They have to fight layers of resistance. And I admire the women who can, fight all these layers and then still overcome them, and are extremely popular in our villages. that was one of the reasons I chose to talk about our Baul woman singer. There are many in Bangladesh, and for them, it's just not socioeconomic struggle, it is also the struggle within the hierarchy of their practice. So this is something that we should actually look at. Thank you.
I think the question, is sort of, there are so many forms of performance, so many genres, even within, say, something like theater, which I deal with. And, there are different historical moments. And so this question would sort of vary, the answer would vary according to this, which theater are we talking about? Is it the professional theater, the amateur theater, the street theater and things? But generally, to answer your question, I would say, a framework which we use a lot when it comes to, the male gaze, the desire, the idea of the entertainment, which we saw right from 19th century, when the woman came into the theater in Calcutta in 1871, that the way the woman sort of responded to it, and because these were women who were coming from red light area with a very interesting sort of what we call the active sexuality instead of a passive sexuality, which just made them the object of the gaze. And we know that active sexuality sort of creates a very interesting mise-en-scene in the theater, the erotic zones in the theater and outside, and they can actually sort of disrupt social hierarchies and social relationships. We know these actresses like Binodini, Tara Sundari, they were Esther Leach, they were mistresses of very powerful men in the Bengali society. So I think that's a very interesting way we look at it. And the sort of theater we've been talking about today, the political theater, agitprop, it's very interesting because all the time there was that whole idea that, when the women were sort of coming into the political theater or the agitprop, that the idea of the entertainment, that the women are entertaining, would suddenly go away. Which it doesn't, that's the contradiction there. So we felt, that the affect of politics, emotion, melodrama of transformation is going to take care of that, and the women will not be objectified. But in the context of the larger society, where capitalist society, where, the culture industry works, women would always be commodified. And these are the contradictions which, different actresses broke at different times, and there are very different historical trajectories, which are the sort of things which we study and research. Yeah.
Yeah, the responses have been rich enough. I just wanted to sort of point towards a certain kind of a theoretical catch-22 that a very sort of important theorist in performance studies places before us, Peggy Phelan, in her essay, The Ontology of Performance, which is part of her book, Unmarked. She actually says that there is this strange kind of double bind. So women, when they represent themselves, and she's drawing from a lot of second wave feminist theory here, women, when they represent themselves in performance, represent themselves within the terms of phallogocentrism. So the very choice of representing oneself it sort of carries with it the risk of objectification, right? So it cannot always entirely be avoided. But she says something very, very interesting. She says that choosing not to represent oneself altogether is once again falling back into invisibility, marginality, and silence, which is anyway the place of women within patriarchy. So therefore, what women might do in these spaces is to perhaps somehow show the artifice, the counterfeit of the currency of exchange, right? So in a certain way, you look at, and this is kind of echoing Butler when she talks about drag, the notion that you actually expose the terms of violence which are written into modes of representation, and so this same thing can be seen in the way that a lot of feminist performance artists of the 70s in America and elsewhere are representing their own bodies explicitly. So nudity in feminist performance art, in fact, becomes a sort of a parody of pornography. Right, so one is representing the nude female body, but one is doing it in such a way that it actually sort of exposes the violence of pornography and objectification rather than the other way around. So briefly this, so there are sort of interesting ways to respond to this. Yeah.
I'll read out another question for the panel from the question answer box. So this is a question Abhisikta Das Gupta is asking. Much of the recent scholarship on the performative aspects of CAA protests have borrowed from the idea of assembly. Is it a conscious choice on your part?
It's for Urmidi, I think.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Sorry.
So one of my training, one of the part of my training that I understand more and more every day as I write practice, and I try to kind of develop my writing on analysis, is the focus on ensemble, on community. Because on one hand, I'm looking at community as the space of performance, which Lubna was talking about, of people who have as part of their life, as living tradition, have performed, and it's not about training individually, it's about being able to perform because you have been born into a community. And that sense of community then has made me look at the community and assembly and ensemble in the creative arts, a creative dance space, and vis-a-vis the classical dance space in a very different manner, where you actually are born, I mean, in classical, you actually are trained as a competitive subject, a person who is in competition even with the teacher thinks so. So this is in contrast with a place which is a theater training space, more kind of, it is defined as a kind of theater space where you cannot but be trained in being with each other. So a body can perform by itself sometimes, but the body in theater is usually generating a certain kind of theater. Most of the theater games that we play are about training bodies in community. So which is why Shaheen Bagh, for me, when I read it, all my questions, if you will see, it sees the whole place as a choreography. And I've said that I don't want to look at it, don't want to belittle that the seriousness of the space, but by calling it choreography, not at all. But the other way around, because it is a space which generates a certain kind of image in the body, which in the mind, which stays because of its choreography. I think it makes that impact because of its choreography.
This is a question for the entire panel, which Dr. Rajkumar Majinder is asking. How can you put emphasis on roles of thought process, space material, and performer itself in recent performances in public spaces protest?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but so far as the space question is concerned, I had tried to sort of address it in my talk already. The interesting thing for me vis-a-vis sort of protest in public spaces and the politics of it is what is possible in which space. So, for example, we know in Delhi that Jantar Mantar is almost like a designated space of protest. So when something happens there is a certain kind of containing of whatever radical move that can be made in terms of simply urban geography, that it is sort of you know where it's going to be. There is a certain safety in that. But when various kinds of ruptures are created in unexpected spaces, which is exactly what Googie is trying to say, that it's a lot about the external relations. It's meant to happen in Jantar Mantar, but the fact that the state was faced with an unpredictability in Shaheen Bagh, that creates a kind of a new rupture, which perhaps in the terms of Francia we could call dissensus. That is what actually sort of pushes the boundaries of protest further. I think that's my response. I don't know what else was meant by the question.
one thing which I would just like to add to Trina, because I was looking at that Red Fort, performance that Artists United Against Hate. Also, that site, it has a whole history, right from, Nehru raising the flag at midnight with all these, the 25 years of Indian independence, the 50 years, Theatre Olympics. And suddenly when a break comes of, what is expected, because that space also gets sort of the memory of performances, historical performances, canonical performances, get sort of attached to the place. So I think when that also breaks is very interesting. And that's why, that Maya's and all those protest performances at that stage was quite interesting. And also, the Lara Shalson sort of argument, and in America, a lot of the people who look at performance art, even Shannon Jackson, which is durational, sort of connected to these, the performers also in the protest sites, as if, that durational sort of performative bodies, which are from performance art, which sort of creates a certain performative, body sort of gets transposed into these spaces. And that durational site, and she uses a lot of, Ori Bergson's idea of the time and space, is what sort of then shapes the, the performance which are in that site, which is a, sort of interesting theoretically, if you would like to take that up. I thought, yeah.
There is one question by Mayurakshi Sen. She says, I wanted to ask if our speakers could speak a bit more about the surveillance of classical and deviant/resistive bodies by the majoritarian discourse and policies. Since the performance/presence of protest and everyday caregiving by women's bodies creates an insistent rupture in the public sphere, can existing state apparatuses co-opt such performative protests? How can such surveillance be negotiated to sustain resistance?
I mean, just briefly, I think the last question, Mayurakshi, there is no guarantee ever that any sort of radical protest would finally not be co-opted either by the market or by capital or by the state. You can never have a full-fledged guarantee that that is not going to happen. But I think instead of so this idea has come through in all three of our papers. This which also is there in the Googie passage that I was reading, which is the idea of ignition. The notion that there are moments of of radical rupture which then ignite unpredictably other moments over time. So there might not be a continuity in terms of constant sort of consolidation, right? So protests congeal into establishments, protests go into institutional co-option towards various kinds of, that is historically true. But the notion that this idea that Diana Taylor says, a meme that catches on, so it might not happen in Latin America, but it catches on in another continent in a certain way. A particular gesture that Piyadi was talking about, a particular gesture becomes echoed. So these are resonances over time that can ignite in different contexts moments of radical rupture. So rather than looking at a sort of consolidation over kind of which is linear and progressive, perhaps we also need to look at in the Benjaminian sense sort of some messianic moments which ignite each other, where there are echoes, historical echoes over time, rather than but there is genuinely, even the Arab Spring, the way it ends, if you actually look at that, it's always depressing. So in that way. So that's my reading. That's very personal, but other people. Urmili, yeah.
So I would like to add to Trina that sometimes strategies are devised, and it's interesting to see that like in terms of JNU protest, if you see many of the very corporate policies of organizing flash dance for advertising. But flash dance was not started by corporates. It was incorporated by corporates, but flash dance was a mode of protest of different kinds, of being in public, and the surprise element would be that element which would actually allow people to do something and run away. So that element was utilized by the corporate. And then it actually has been utilized by many protest sites in Delhi again then. So in JNU, we have had such a huge kind of a very visible flash dance with lights and torch, which made a huge impact, because it's just that those kinds of devising of new things, and you don't even know when what one thing would be um, successful and not the other. And on certain days you do it in desperation, in certain days you do it as a planned gesture. So there's nothing kind of a you can't give it a structure that way. Yeah.
Mayurakshi, my thing is a bit different, because I would say, when we had a more sort of a democratic liberal government, we did see how a lot of the protests and the protest strategies were co-opted, and it sort of, we know the walk went into sort of the Jaipur literary festivals and the gay parades, and but very interesting, with the right wing coming to power and the sort of the right wing populism, and not only in India, all over the world. You've just sort of come back from US. I think these are now quite well marked, and what the right wing populism tries to do, they try to create a sort of a consensus. And the interesting part is, and this is also, when Tony Fisher and Ifakhat Suraki is sort of looking at that consensus is hegemonic. There is no consensus. If you're putting up your hand and say, Jai Ram, Jai Siya, whatever, and everybody echoing it, there's bound to be actually a collapse. It's a sort of a, simplistic emulation of a gesture, which really doesn't show, a sort of people coming together. So therefore, what is interesting, and, and I've been trying to think of that, what are we looking at, after, Shatal Moof's big argument that does the left need populism? I think it's, the other way around, that how we actually want the consensus to break in these sides. And that's how the dissonances come. And that's where, all the social and cultural sort of, the structural divides, which is there everywhere, will start showing up. And then it's a sort of a democratic articulation, which is the strategy of the, the new politics, which I think we're talking about.
I think we can take one last question, and then perhaps we need to wrap up the conversation. This question is by Aman Mohammadi. In the context of Shaheen Bagh, the Muslim woman's body is accepted in a public domain by the community. But at the same time, their entry in the religious spaces like mosques remains restricted. Then don't you think this agency of performing bodies, in brackets, in protest, is also controlled in some ways? As in which spaces her agency to perform is acceptable and in which it's not?
What I feel is that it's not about any religious specificity, but I feel that in all societies, linguistic, religious, we have seen these kinds of ostracization and marking of space for women. And even in the mainstream religious practices, this marking of spaces are very, very clear in today's instances, side by side with all other religions. So I feel that these are spaces that are naturally marked, and when you wrest it away, that's the interesting part, because you wrest it away through these performance spaces where you become the visible body. So where I actually have talked about this in, these kinds of, there's a NGO which actually shows you presence of women in public spaces. And when, that kind of, the usual absence of women in public spaces, in temple spaces, in mosques, in very, very many other venues, public venues, that is challenged by such spaces which create this agency for women in a specific manner, where the justification does not exist within the social justification, but it's a political agency, it's a political presence. And therefore, it is true. What you say, Aman, is very, very true. But in that sense, these are also spaces which, at least partially, for a very small bit of time, make this space available and a more kind of powerful space for bodies that are otherwise invisible. Maybe the outcome is not always positive for us. As you know, in like many protests, just like Trina said, the ending makes you sad in many manners. It makes you really, really sad. But then these are spaces which have the energy at that moment, and then it becomes history as a powerful moment. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
just briefly, just for half a minute, wanted to point to Nivedita's paper last year that some of us were witness to, Urmi and Bishnupriya Dutt as well, where she actually spoke about how these protests were in fact performing the constitution in a certain way, where the constitution was almost becoming like a radical symbol that could be mobilized. So rather than the constitution being a text, the way that it was in fact being sort of mobilized in different protest sites created a different kind of grammar, a different kind of vortex of forces around it. So rather than see the constitution as this kind of symbol of the liberal nation state, to actually see how people might be mobilizing the constitution on the street, including, say, the Bhim Army leader and all of this, just holding it up at the Jama Masjid. That photograph is in fact a radical photograph in my view. So I think Nivedita did a very interesting job of sort of tying these moments together.
Thank you so much. I was thinking how to sum this up and conclude it. I really want to say I'm quite intrigued by the density of thinking that the listeners or the audience have put in, and also the panelists for your patience. Because my mind, quite honestly, kept digressing, and I constantly, because we were talking about body so much, I kept thinking that the body is now cut into two halves, and you can't. My lower body is of no use, as it were, and then, of course, a very obvious but an interesting question is the role of technology vis-a-vis women's protests and movements. Because we do know that, invention of photography kind of gave an impetus to suffrage at a point in time. So I think that I don't really have concluding thoughts. But I do have these questions, and this is one of the area that we could locate our further thoughts into. Once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in and thinking as much. And thank you, all the panelists, and Lubna Di, of course, and the KCC for organizing, these little windows coming together. Thanks a lot. Maybe Srabasti or Titas can take over from here.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Meghna. Honestly, I was also going into various realms while I was listening to all of them, sometimes in a collective space, sometimes quite viscerally, the experience of the space that is there in the body, and how sometimes this collectivity becomes political, sometimes just the solowness of the body in the space is so political that it talks a lot, and so many things can be read. And I really loved so much questions came in. There are a lot of questions that we couldn't answer, but those questions will be there and will be shared with the panel, and that is for sure. And we'll get back with the answers. I would just, before finishing, take 5 minutes to present our outreach partners for this conference, who really helped us reaching to people and informing the students to come and join this wonderful conference. We're learning so much together. So our partners are Sadhana, Center for Advancement in South Asian Culture, Dhaka, Bangladesh; Ananya Dance Theatre, Minneapolis, USA; Sandbox Collective, Bangalore, India; Flame University, Pune, India; and School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University, Kolkata, India. And we have our exclusive radio partner, Red FM. Tomorrow's theme of the conference is Agency in Performance, with the panel by Dr. Anuradha Kapur, Dr. Urmimala Sarkar Munshi, Ms. Zuleikha Chaudhuri, and Dr. Trina Nileena Banerjee will be moderating the panel. Dr. Ananya Chatterjea will be as a keynote speaker. I would request everybody to join the session at least 15 minutes prior, just like today. And we are hoping to have a very efficient and as intriguing as today's panel. Thank you so much for everybody for being here. Thank you. Good night.